A little over a month ago now, I made a two-part video series where we looked through a killer animals iceberg which featured creatures from all around the world, and by world I mean India, who had at some point or another killed multiple people. And while I am very happy with how those two videos came out, there is still one issue, because within all of those 50 or so entries, there's one case which is absent, as I completely forgot to include it. And that is a massive disservice, as it is one of the most famous tales of man-eating animals, due in no small part to the extreme number of people who died. So I had a rare moment to think, and decided what better way to remedy this than by giving this story an entire video all to itself. And what exactly is this story? Well, it's no other than the famous World War II Battle of Ramree Island. An engagement which would end with the Japanese being forced to retreat through a mangrove swamp infested with saltwater crocodiles. And these reptiles would kill and eat at minimum 500 men, with some of the highest estimates going all the way up to 1,000. The island itself is known solely for this story, so much so that if you were to Google Ramree Island, this is the first image Google will show you. This mass attack by animals would be solidified in the Guinness World Book of Records as the most human fatalities caused by a crocodile attack. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, this would be the second most amount of people killed by a group of animals, right behind the Lions of Ninjombe, who killed 1,500 people. However, the world record the Battle of Ramree Island can claim is the most deaths by animal in a single day. Because while the Lions of Ninjombe did kill 1,500 people, it was over a 15-year period and lasted for 3 generations of the pride. The crocodiles inhabiting Ramree Island did all their work in just one day. Supposedly. So yeah, it's not all sunshine and mass death for these crocodiles. There are a lot of contradictions to the story, and a lot of debate has been raised over whether any of it is true. Which, in my opinion, and I'm sure you all feel the same way, you're just as shocked and horrified as me. If this story isn't true, that would mean the Guinness World Book of Records is an untrustworthy source. I know. It's heartbreaking, but that's why I'm here. We're gonna go through the full narrative of the Battle of Ramree Island as it's told in the legends that the killer crocs would in fact be responsible for the deaths of 500 people. However, I feel it'd be really boring to just skip right to the Crocodile massacre without any proper setup of the invasion, so instead I spent a good amount of my time researching this invasion and just kind of putting it all together into one coherent narrative. Listen, if you like very detailed and expertly animated overviews of battles in World War II, go and watch the Operation Room. But if you want one specifically about Ramree Island, you gotta stay here. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one. You got no choice. So let's go through the history of this battle, and maybe along the way we'll learn some things, have some fun, and I'll mispronounce some foreign words. Oh, and if some of you are going to feel upset by the fact I'll make a few jokes about, you know, the Japanese soldiers being killed by crocodiles and such, Unit 731. And with all that out of the way, I just want to say, if you think I've earned it, by the end of the video, please do subscribe to the channel so we can grow up into a big, beautiful butterfly channel thing. Seriously though, your subscription really can help out because it shows YouTube that this channel is something worth promoting. So, if you think I've earned it, please do subscribe. But aside from that, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let's get into it. Hi, I lied and I've now tricked you into learning about island geography. Very fun. On an important note though, this is actually really crucial to understand as it's going to play a massive role later. Ramree Island is part of the country Myanmar. However, during World War II, Myanmar was ruled by Britain and was called Burma, which I will be calling it by for the rest of this video to keep things simple. With only a 150 meter wide stretch of water separating the island from the mainland, it's not overly disconnected from Burma, and being 1,350 square meters in size, it's not overly small either. And this is demonstrated by the fact that Ramree Island is able to sustain a varied amount of fauna as well as a wide mix of different ecosystems. If we were to look around on Google Earth, we can see a fair few different aspects of the island. We see the sea attached to a large stretch of beaches. There's a fair amount of jungles, flat plains, and hilly areas intermingled with different villages and towns. We've got this guy, pretty sure that's one of the previous avatars. A lot of waterways which have led to the creation of many mangrove swamps. And of course, the natural Google Earth watermark. Truly a thriving ecosystem, and a solid place to hold a defense if you were to need one. All in all, the western coastline and more of the central areas are not really anything important in terms of terrain. It's when we get to these areas that things start to unravel. So I found this quite nice little map which gives some indication on the important positions and movements during the operation to capture this island, which we'll talk about later. And it has two very useful things. Number one, it marks out where all of the mangrove swamps are, which is very useful, and number two, it shows the location where the crocodile attack would take place. Now, if we move back to the satellite image provided by Google Earth, we can see just how treacherous this area would have been. It is incomprehensible how difficult it would have been to retreat through this area while under fire and without having any form of transport. You would be wading through thick, knee-deep or worse mud, battling mosquitoes, scorpions, and whatever other horrific things are in there. The exposure to the harsh elements and exhaustion you would feel would make your unit need to carry an exceedingly large amount of supplies, and if they ran out, you would be left suffering from starvation and dehydration in addition. Then, on top of all that, you could reach a river which you would need to cross in order to escape, and as you did so, you would very quickly realize you're not alone in there. Because the swamps are home to massive saltwater crocodiles, the largest reptiles on the planet, and one of the few animals alive which actively hunt human beings. Now, with all that, there is one caveat that needs to be mentioned. All the images I've shown here, the satellite footage, or whenever I was able to get on Street View, they are all from around 2024. 50 years after the Battle of Ramree Island would take place. Over 50 years of human development into the natural land is going to alter it in massive ways. Whatever you see here, it would have been significantly worse back then. All this that I've just rattled on about for however long is basically just to say, you want to stay here and avoid this area at all costs. But okay, I know, I'm being boring again. This is like the Warwolf video. You've got to sit through some of the history in order to get to the fun big catapult. We are almost there at the fun big catapult of this video, because it's time to talk about World War II. The origins of World War II are closely linked to World War I. As Archduke Ferdinand was travelling in a car in one of these countries, something happened which was bad, some people didn't like it, and then they did some not nice stuff, then Hitler, and then we're at May of 1942. As a result of a successful invasion of Burma, which forced the Allies to retreat northwards back into India, Japan was able to gain control over the entire country. Burma was seen seen as non-essential by Britain at the time. It was considered a backwater country, and so most of the resources that would have gone to defending it went to other fronts, like defending Britain itself from the Luftwaffe and U-boats, and also defending Britain's holdings in Africa, the latter of which also received very underwhelming supplies, so you can imagine how bad it would have been for Burma. The British, Indian, and Burmese soldiers, along with their Chinese allies, were woefully unprepared for the Japanese advances and suffered significant losses. The unwillingness to properly defend Burma was felt most by the civilians that now had to live under Japanese rule. They faced horrific conditions. There were mass killings, and forced labor became a normal part of life. The mistreatment of the people living there would have made it an actual hell. So why am I telling you all this? Well, it's just to remind you. Those crocodiles were war heroes. They saved those people. As the year turned over to 1944 though, the balance of power was shifting steadily in the Allies' favour. Better decision making was happening at the highest levels of command, and at the literal highest level, air superiority was slowly becoming the norm. This allowed for more potent strategies to be employed, as well as allowing for more damage to be inflicted at a further range than would have previously been allowed. And after an invasion of India would cost the Japanese an immense amount of men and machinery, it was decided that a counterattack into Burma would take place. These would consist of a land-based northern and central push, along with an amphibious landing in the south, and though this latter one was more of a diversion, it is where the Battle of Ramree Island would take place. By the date of January the 21st, 1945, British forces held territory all along the Arakan region of southern Burma, and some of these positions, like Akyab Island, which isn't actually an island by the way, provided deep water ports for Royal Navy ships, which would make further amphibious landings more possible. It also held an airfield which allowed for further air coverage. However, the Allies would need even more airfields to continue operations further south, and so they needed to look for a suitable location. The airfields would obviously require a large amount of solid land, but also need to be close to the coastline in order to make supply runs a lot less complicated. So it should come as little shock that we're not going to be completely diverting to another battle. We're instead going to be looking at the invasion of Ramree Island, whose sole purpose was to house an airfield. And on that day of January 21st, 1945, landing operations would commence. The British forces would be led by Major General Cyril Ernest Napier Lomax, and when you have so many names, you know you're a top-tier commander. And in his very capable hands would be a group of about 6,000 men, along with ships from the Royal Navy who would provide covering fire. These would be the 4th, 26th, 36th, and 71st Indian Infantry Divisions, elements of 3 Commando Brigade, and 146th Regiment Royal Armoured Corps. The Japanese, meanwhile, were led by Kenichi Nagasawa, and he had under his control the 2nd and 121st Regiment, as well as part of the 54th Division. In addition, there was an artillery detachment which was meant to act more independently and was going to be used to cover the beaches from any amphibious assault. In total, the garrison ordered to defend Ramree Island comprised of approximately 1,000 to 1,500 soldiers. Unfortunately for them, however, the fact that they had significantly less soldiers than the enemy was not the only decisive element, as very early on, a major blunder was made. Hey, what's up? I'm upstairs now and wearing different clothes, and also there's a gecko. Do not be alarmed. So now we're finally going to get into the map section, and you're about to see some of the best art in the world. There are only two issues. Number one, I am a terrible liar, and number two, it's really hard to be accurate here. What I mean by that is, while I can definitively say the Allies captured X settlement on Y-date, the movements of soldiers and exactly what land is controlled by whomst is much more annoying to figure out, and there is just a higher chance of it being inaccurate. This extends also to whenever I mention particular units, because while I'm fairly confident the list I gave before was correct, I might get a few things wrong when I say this unit did this, for example. The important thing is, none of this will affect the overall narrative. That will all be 100% intact, so I've gone to a lot of lengths to make sure that is true, but a few of the smaller details, there might be a few little mistakes, so I do apologize for that. But again, none of these will be a massive issue or anything. I've just noticed that this has probably been in the way the entire time. I'm not going to re-record that because I think it's funny, but sure. Do you want to say hi to everyone, Mr. Gecko? But okay, with all of that out of the way, let's get back down to the cellar. General Kenichi Nagasawa would fail to anticipate correctly where the Allied assault would begin from. He had concentrated his main defense around Thames Point, with the bulk of his forces being in Ramree town itself, which is more or less in the center of the island. Now, this location will end up being very important later, as it would leave very few viable options for escape. The Allies under Operation Matador would actually land at the northern point of the island, and within a day or so, under very little resistance, would be able to capture the port town of Kiakfu, which also housed the island's airfield. So already they had put the Japanese at an even further disadvantage. Now, while this island is famous for its terrain destroying the Japanese, it would also prevent the Allies from making just a clean cut through the island. They had to move south along the coast, which was something the 71st Regiment would do. They began moving southwards until they would come to a point known as Black Hill, where it was expected the Japanese would hold a strong defense, as they were on a hill and they were overlooking a narrow point with the swamps and ocean blocking their flanks. But before I go even a second further, I need to give a massive shout out to the World War II forms. See, when I was researching this, I came to this point where I needed to look up Black Hill to see where it was, but I couldn't really find anything. That is until I found this form, where I was able to find this battle map, which shows a lot of important positions that I will need to copy over to Google Earth. Now, I'm not just going to steal the map and upload it for my own use. That would be wrong. Also, it's really low res, but I am going to use its information for the good of this video. So, again, massive shout out to this form. Really useful. There was actually a load of other stuff here as well, which I also used for research. So, yeah. Thank you. Makes life easier for me. Back on track at Black Hill, something strange would happen. Despite it being a really good place to hold a defense, it was lacking in that defense. The 71st Regiment would receive some resistance, but nowhere near as much as was anticipated, leading them to be able to very quickly overwhelm the Japanese guarding the hill and force them to retreat. And by the 26th of January, they had reached the Yanbauk Chon. So the Yanbauk is one of many chons which are scattered through the island, but in reality they're just waterways, and that's what I'm going to call them from this point onwards. Why are they called chons? I have no idea. That's a question for God. Even when I googled them, I could find nothing. Also, probably mispronouncing this word. I literally just put it into Google Translate to see what it said.
Chawns. Chawns.
Either way, not really important. This was a defensive position, and the first defensive position that would actually require a significant amount of strength or strategy to break through. The Japanese had set up a strong position on the south, while the Allies were trying to push through from the north. Whilst they were stopped there, the groundworks were set in place to establish a second landing point on the island. Between the 26th and 30th of January, the two smaller islands around Ramree, Cheduba and Sagyukium, would be successfully captured without any opposition. Securing these areas would enable units from the 36th Indian Infantry Regiment to land on the southern tip of Ramree Island almost completely unopposed on the 1st of February. While this position wouldn't allow the soldiers to immediately conduct a pincer maneuver due to the impassable terrain, it would act as a diversion to draw more Japanese troops away from the main contact line, as well as opening up the now undefended Kalamdon River, which would allow destroyers and other ships to enter upstream and provide more covering fire. Back at the Yanbaokchon, with attempts to push through continuously failing, the 71st were instead ordered to flank the Japanese defense by capturing the town of Sein. Getting insane is what command was asking the 71st to do, as getting insane would mean moving a significant distance from the coastline. This would put the troops beyond the range of covering fire from the Royal Navy, which at this point had been shelling the Japanese almost non-stop. However, again though, despite being in the heart of Ramree Island itself now, and well within striking range of the main Japanese fortification, Ramree Town, the battle was still decisively in the Allies' favour. In only a few days, on the 7th of February, they were able to capture the settlement of Sein, and this forced the Japanese to immediately retreat from their dominating position across the Yanbaokchon. This defeat seemed to be the breaking point of the Japanese army, as they would soon be thrust into a rout, leaving Ramree Town itself on the 8th of February. They now had no more strong positions to fall back to, no way to get resupplied, and were being pursued from 3 different directions. All this and more to say, the Japanese were left with 2 choices. Number 1 was surrender, something which is frowned upon so much in their country and culture that committing swordicide is actually preferable. Or, immediately, the 1,000 remaining men could conduct a retreat through the mangrove swamps to the west. And either because they didn't know the dangers inside, or they knew the dangers but thought they could handle it, or because they just had no other choice in their minds, they chose the latter option. Unfortunately for them though, the crocodiles inhabiting this swamp weren't able to comprehend crimes against humanity. But I guess neither could the Japanese, so it's an even playing field. Playing swamp. As the terrain the Japanese entered became less and less solid, the pursuers would stop and hold a defensive line to prevent any escapees returning. They would, however, make multiple calls for the Japanese to surrender, however these were seldom, if ever, accepted. A decision many of them would soon regret, as all the commotion in their home had awoken a group of hungry saltwater crocodiles, and they had sensed an easy meal. These reptiles are absolutely enormous and incredibly dangerous. They grow over 7 meters in length and can weigh more than a ton. Despite those enormous numbers though, they move deceptively fast when in the water, and if they're able to catch you, they're gonna bite down with 16,000 newtons of force. And as I mentioned earlier, they are one of the few animals that will actively hunt humans. They are certified man-eaters through and through. If you give any man a sufficiently powered gun, put him in a boat and tell him to fight a crocodile, he will win 100% of the time. However, you take that boat away and suddenly the crocodile is gonna win 100% of the time. But I know what you're thinking, and it's a valid think. Gun. gun strong against animal, and Japanese soldier have gun. So realistically, you're still out of luck, because the skin of a crocodile is so thick and they're so tanky, the only way you can guarantee they'll die instantly is by headshotting them. Every single one of those Japanese soldiers, the second they were targeted by a crocodile, would have mere moments to land a difficult, accurate shot while in either water or mud and under an immense amount of stress. Needless to say, not a lot of them were able to pull it off. The date was the 19th of February, 1945, and I know the two of you still paying attention are going to be like, wait a minute, that's a bit of a time jump. Oh, don't worry, we'll get there later. The Royal Navy had set up a flotilla to block any escape attempt via the water, forcing the Japanese to remain trapped within the mangrove swamps, their only salvation being a long walk all the way across the swamps until they could theoretically cross into Burma. Back on the British side though, there was one gunboat crew guarding the island who would very soon learn how foolhardy this escape attempt was. Now, I couldn't find any names of these men or even the exact location they were stationed, but one of them would tell their story to a soldier named Bruce Wright. He was a Canadian biologist and lieutenant commander at this time, and he would be the one to share the story of the crocodile massacre of Ramree Island. Now, there are a few sites which state that Bruce Wright was on the island at the time of the attack and witnessed the whole thing. This is not true. He only heard the tale from another source and wasn't actually on the island at all. Regardless though, this is what one of those gunboat crewmen would claim happened. On that night of the 19th of February, a group of about 500 to potentially 1,000 Japanese soldiers were traveling through the marshland. As they waded through the water, however, desperately trying to escape, an unknown amount of saltwater crocodiles would ambush them and begin killing them off one by one, devouring them all. This is a direct quote which was told to Bruce Wright. That night was the most horrible that any member of the ML Marine Launch crews ever experienced. The scattered rifle shots in the pitch-black swamp, punctuated by the screams of wounded men crushed in the jaws of huge reptiles, and the blurred, worrying sound of spinning crocodiles made for a cacophony of hell that has rarely been duplicated on Earth. At dawn, the vultures arrived to clean up what the crocodiles had left. Of about 1,000 Japanese soldiers that entered the swamp of Ramree, only 20 were found alive. Whether it was happening all over the island, or if the tides had just forced the Japanese into one small area, we're not really sure, but the end results are the same. They were massacred in numbers never before seen when it comes to animal attacks. Slowed down or just left straight up helpless in the water against an animal that has mastered that domain, they had no chance. I think the most terrifying aspect of all this is the speed in which it happened. This was done in one night. In one night, 1,000 men were eaten by crocodiles. That sentence alone is horrifying. And when's all said and done, as the morning light graced the swamp, 20 of those men would somehow be able to scramble out of the swamp, and now they would accept surrender. That would mean that while the most widely distributed amount of deaths is about 500, the highest it possibly could be would be 980. I know I'm being a bit repetitive, but it's just a crazy amount. It is incredible in a morbid kind of way how hellish the situation must have been for those men. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your nationality, saltwater crocodiles are in decline, or perhaps even extinct, on Ramree Island due to human encroachment. But just the thought of being in that swamp, even in today's era where it's a lot less wild, the prospect of there being a enormous dinosaur-like creature underneath you at any moment, it's something that I think should be explored. It almost makes me wonder, what if I was to go there myself, travel to Ramree Island and see the swamp for myself, witness what those Japanese soldiers would have had to travel through, and maybe even find the location of the massacre? No. Now listen, I love trudging through swamps with potential 6-meter long reptiles hidden underneath the water's surface as much as the next guy, but sadly, that doesn't fall under essential travel, according to the government. You know, after doing all this research, which is very closely tied to World War II, I would have thought that we won, that we got rid of fascism, but no, they still get to decide what's classified as safe. It's called a civil war, guys. It's got civil in the name. What do you think that word means? Absolute troglodytes, there's just no helping them. Anyway, we've gone through the history of Ramree Island during World War II. Now, let's look at why the ending part with the man-eating crocodiles is probably definitely not real. The best way to start off this part of the video is to point out some of the inconsistencies with Bruce Wright's claims. To be fair, he's not the only or even first source for the story of these man-eating crocodiles. His is just the most cited and the most detailed. But for brevity, this is the earliest one I could find. It's from a segment in the Guardian newspaper, which was posted on the 24th of February 1945, and it gives a very brief description of what happened on Ramree Island. Now, the first big issue is in regards to the date on both of these claims. They don't make any sense with the timeline we know. By the 8th of February, Allied troops had captured the main Japanese hub of Ramree town. At this point, the Japanese were in full retreat and were starting to make their way into the mangrove swamps. To be fair, we'll say that they held some positions just outside of Ramree town itself where a sturdy defense could have been made, and this might have bought them a few extra days before they had to run off into the swamps. However, I don't think it would have been enough to buy them 11 whole days. Remember, there were a lot more fortified positions all over the island. None of them lasted that long. And the reason why I specify 11 days is because that's the earliest known report of the Crocodile massacre happening. I personally think if we look at how the Battle of Ramree Island had played out before, that it's reasonable to say that by at least the 10th of February, the Japanese soldiers were all in the swamp. So that begs the question, were the crocodiles just like, oh boy, if you stay in here for one more week, Buster, you're gonna get it? Maybe they had a meeting to discuss the potential political implications of joining the Allies. Who knows? I know, I'm being mean, I'm well aware, and I also don't care. It's very, very possible that the main habitat of the saltwater crocodiles was much further in the marshland swamps, so there would have been a delay before the Japanese crossed paths with them, at which point the account retold to Bruce Wright would have taken place. But that is just a drop of Japanese blood in the mangrove swamps of debunking this claim. There's a much bigger issue, and I'll tell that now. In all of the after-battle reports, or from the memoirs of commanders, generals, and soldiers, most importantly Japanese soldiers, with the exception of that one gunboat crew, there is practically no mention of man-eating crocodiles on the scale that is commonly believed. It's fairly well believed that during the retreat, a lot of Japanese soldiers would end up dying in the swamp, and there are even a few scattered mentions of them being eaten by saltwater crocodiles. But the numbers and the causation of death are very different than what is typically told. Approximately 1,000 of them would enter the mangrove swamps, and 1,000 men need enough food and water for 1,000 men, neither of which could be acquired in the brackish water surrounding them. They would have obviously been able to bring some supplies with them, but remember, there was a Royal Navy flotilla blocking access to the island and escape, and that blockade would would last 14 days, giving ample time for any resources to be withered away. And the Japanese along the coastline of Burma were still under heavy attack, so the chance of being resupplied was very, very slim. So what does that all mean? Well, it's speculated by historians, based on a lot of reports in the time, that of the 1,000 men who entered the swamp, 500 of them would indeed die. However, the main causation of death was dehydration and disease. Dehydration being self-explanatory, and disease being because when they were thirsty, the soldiers would try to drink the brackish water, which would not go well, as I'm sure a lot of you know. I'm just realizing there's probably at least a couple people that don't know what brackish water is. It's basically more inland salt water. You know, as the ocean moves inland through rivers, it like mixes with fresh water, I think. Just don't drink it. That's like the short and sweet. Now, there was also other causes of death in the swamp. Drowning was a big one. There was also strafing by Allied planes. A lot of them tried to escape and were shot by ships. And a few of them, yes, did in fact die to crocodiles. However, the numbers are disputed, but rather small regardless. And what removes even further doubt that the crocodile massacre of Ramree Island isn't real is the fact that of those 1,000 men that I've mentioned about 20 times now, there's still another 500 not accounted for. What happened to them? They survived. So this particular claim from the gunboat crew makes no sense, because it implies that only 20 of them lived. That is completely wrong. 500 of them were able to escape to Burma. And like, yeah, I could elaborate on that further, but I don't think I need to go into the incredible wonderwaffens the Japanese had called BOATs, buoyancy-operated aquatic transports, which they used to travel across the water in some kind of mythical, unseen way. I am actually lying. We're going to talk about that aspect a little bit later. And I mean, I could also talk about how the crocodiles in this tale don't act like normal crocodiles. Once a croc has his meal, that's it. He'll be satisfied. He's not going to make another kill right after. He's just going to dip until he's hungry again, which could be weeks. And even if we're generous and say there was 1,000 crocodiles, one for every single soldier, it still doesn't really make sense, because typically what happens when a crocodile makes a kill, another bigger one will come up and decide that communism is a great ideology we should all strive to achieve. But I think honestly at this point, my point has been made. Arguably, my point has been made since I said there was no actual reports of a crocodile massacre. That was kind of the nail in the coffin, and I've just been rambling on about other things. But, you know, why not at least talk about a few others? So right, we've gone through the history, geography, invasion, battle, and debunked the myths of Ramree Island. What's there left to do? Well, I think we should finish the story in the proper way. We're gonna head back to the map, which you all love and are all going to say very nice things about in the comments, and we're gonna finish the story of Ramree Island properly. Starting off just before the fanfiction was told, we'll give a quick recap. The Allies have captured practically all of the central, southern, and western parts of the island. And that includes the main Japanese fortification of Ramree town itself. Now, there were still some pockets of resistance, especially down south. However, the main plan for the Japanese now was to get off the island and regroup on the mainland of Burma. The marshlands were incredibly dangerous, yes, but the Japanese had no plans to stay there, nor did they have plans to walk the full 15 kilometers to the mainland. Instead, they would make use of riverboats they had stashed there in order to traverse the waterways to the open ocean and then to Burma itself. And to counter this, the Allies would make use of their navy and put into motion one of the most creatively named operations of history. Operation Block. Guess what its purpose was? Using destroyers, barges, riverboats, minesweepers, whatever they had available, they would block every single one of these waterways that led to the ocean, and therefore an easy escape for the Japanese. Some of these boats would be disguised into the environment around them in order to ambush Japanese soldiers as they were attempting an escape. Meanwhile, smaller ones were sent up into the waterways themselves to harass any soldiers they found, while in addition trying to convince them to surrender, though this was rarely achieved. With all these resources put into this operation, operation, it's no surprise that a lot of Japanese were forced to remain within the thick and loving embrace of the mangrove swamp. However, at this point, something strangely ironic would happen. See, as you all should know by now, in the Battle of Ramree Island, it was the island itself which defeated the Japanese. It was its crocodiles which killed those 500 men. But in reality, the island would actually aid in the escape of 500 men. If we go back to this image, which points out all of the known waterways which are connected to the ocean, we can assume it would have been difficult but not impossible to defend all of these points. However, big problem number one, the British didn't have access to Google Earth. They had planes and that was it. Big problem number two, there were a lot of smaller waterways which the Allies would have missed, and these would allow for Japanese boats to slip by undetected. And big problem number three, the tides. As they rose, more waterways would temporarily be created, allowing a brief window for Japanese boats to escape through. And all of these factors, two of which granted by the island itself, is how roughly 500 of those 1,000 men would escape the island between the 8th and 22nd of February, despite being under Operation Block. Now, just because you were Japanese and in a boat did not mean you had a free ticket to freedom. Drowning would actually be one of the leading causes of death in the swamp. There are estimates that around 40 boats fully loaded with Japanese crew and men were sunk by Allied boats, which would lead to a significant loss of life if accurate. That does prove that, well, as mentioned earlier, a lot of Japanese were able to escape the island. The blockade would be crucial in certain areas. But with them out of the way, now let's turn our attention to the ones who either didn't have access to a boat or just took too long to escape via the waterways. They would remain trapped, and they would be forced to endure the terrors of the swamp. Now, due to the circumstances of the hasty retreat plus the harsh conditions of the swamp, bringing a large amount of supplies would have been a difficult proposition, so instead they would have to settle for a very limited amount. And this limited number, already insufficient, would very quickly begin to run out. Now, it's believed the plan was to cross the entirety of the swamps, arriving at a narrow point in the waterway separating Ramree Island with Burma, a point which they theoretically could swim across. However, accomplishing this task would be next to impossible. As the food and water ran out, starvation and dehydration would set in, the latter being made significantly worse when the soldiers tried to drink the salty water of the brackish swamps, as this would immediately make them even more dehydrated, plus it would add diseases into their already exhausted systems. These then potentially fatal conditions would be compounded even further by the harsh environment they were constantly exposed to, along with the thick mud that would sap their strength with every step. And it's all of those things put together which would lead to a majority of the deaths as they marched across the swamp, with the single most devastating element of all being dehydration. But worry not, that's not all that was killing them. Don't worry, I haven't forgot it. There were some cases where the wildlife itself would play a role, though just in a more realistic way. Now, there's only one almost kind of solid account of crocodiles killing Japanese soldiers, and it happened here. Ish. I'm not actually sure. It said it was near Ramree town, so I'd assume this river, but I also could be wrong. The only information I could find on this was an apparent story told by a local who lived through the Japanese occupation of Ramree town. So not only is it rather short, but take it with a grain of salt. The story goes that presumably not too long after the town was lost, a group of about 10 to 15 soldiers attempted to cross a nearby creek in order to make their way further into the swamp. As they began entering it though, the disturbance of the water would alert the saltwater crocodiles nearby. As the first man was suddenly dragged underwater in an instant, the others were left in a very unenviable situation. Their scenario was none too different than that of a migrating wildebeest. It has to cross this river, but it really doesn't want to, and for good reason. But the only other option would be to stay put and get left behind by its herd, so it must make an attempt to cross. But these men, though, they were dead either way. There were more than enough crocodiles to not only fight for the scraps, but also start new hunts, and one by one, each of the soldiers would be dragged under the water. The lucky ones would be drowned, and the unlucky ones would be torn to pieces. Now, there were some other less descriptive accounts of small pockets of Japanese soldiers being attacked and killed by crocodiles, more than likely in a similar way to what I just told, but we really don't know. In total, though, if we are being very generous, taking all of the accounts into consideration, especially all of the accounts that don't mention a crocodile massacre, we're going to get a number of about 50, maybe 100 people killed by crocodiles. And again, that's being very generous. It could have been a lot lower. It could have been 0 for all we know. There's just no real concrete evidence. It's all from secondhand sources, more or less. So at this point, we have got Japanese men traversing through the swamp, dying in all sorts of ways. Drownings, disease, dehydration, starvation, and a few unlucky ones to crocodiles. But still, well, there was one more cause of death we need to talk about. I'll be honest, I really debated whether I should add this bit in. There's practically no evidence for it, aside from a part of a report from a general, which was later retracted. It's about as fantastical as the Crocodile Massacre. It's probably not true, but just because it's not true doesn't mean it's really cool, so we're gonna talk about it. Also, because if we suspend our disbelief for just a moment, it could actually provide an answer on what that gunner boat crew heard on the 19th of February. A reminder, by the 19th of February, a majority of those 500 soldiers that did escape to Burma would have accomplished that goal by now. Also, Operation Block was much more intense at this point. They were using searchlights and everything. This is also the date commonly cited as when the Crocodile Massacre took place, but as we've discussed earlier, that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. But what happened here happened all the way on the eastern part of Ramree Island, so the fact that the date was significantly after they left Ramree town makes a whole lot of sense. Somehow, through all of those insanely harsh conditions, 100 soldiers had apparently reached the edge of Ramree Island. Now, to make the story that probably isn't true make sense, I'm going to have to apply some creative liberties on where exactly this took place. I'm gonna say it's just here because why not? Essentially, it's alleged that they came to a crossing point that was about 150 meters wide, and if they were able to make it across, they could reach Burma proper and be picked up by their fellow soldiers. Now, 150 meters, that's actually very doable to swim across. A strong swimmer could easily accomplish this. However, would you call a starving, exhausted Japanese soldier that has been fighting for the better part of 6 weeks a strong swimmer? I personally would not. If they were going to complete their escape attempt, they needed to somehow find the determination, strength, and luck to make it across this waterway, and so they began entering it. Not too far away though, with the expected purpose of stopping such an escape attempt was that gunner boat crew that Bruce Wright would later interview, and the things they claimed to hear would turn out to not be fictitious, just mistaken. It was not the panic-stricken shrieks of men attempting to cross a creek they knew was dangerous. It was men drowning in the ocean. And it was not agonizing screams for help as they were torn to pieces by gigantic reptiles. It was, probably not, but maybe it could be true, we don't know, it was the screams of men being eaten by sharks. Oh yes, it's a good day for man-eating animal fans, of which I am one. I know I'm not very mentally well put together, I'm sorry. We've got sharks, man-eating sharks on Ramree Island. Man, if I had a nickel for every... The way this allegedly played out was very similar to the USS Indianapolis sinking, where sharks would test the strength of sailors, and if they found them weak enough, would drag them under the water to kill and eat them. As the Japanese soldiers attempted to swim for freedom, the sharks would arrive, alerted by the noise, and would begin testing the strength of each of them. And if the soldier wasn't strong enough to fight it off, well, that would be it for them. They would be dragged under, never to be seen again. Now, as you can imagine, we don't have very many accurate numbers to go off here, because there's nothing really accurate about this source, let's be realistic, but let's ignore all of the evidence, facts, and realism and just say, you're all wrong, it wasn't a crocodile massacre on Ramree Island, it was actually a shark massacre, I'm right, you're wrong. Anyway though, with that very logical conclusion I've just come to, we've reached the end of the Battle of Ramree Island. The number of Japanese soldiers who would be captured by the Allies would remain the same in both stories. It was only about 20 odd men, and those men almost certainly didn't willingly surrender. They were caught after being found exhausted, dehydrated, and starving in the swamp. And on the 22nd of February, the blockade would be removed, and the entirety of Ramree Island would be declared 100% in Allied control. Its airfield would be a crucial asset in not only carrying out raids further into Burma, but also capturing more territory all the way up until the end of the war. The landscape of Ramree Island would begin changing more over time. As its population grew, so did the encroachment on the wildlife, which would eventually lead to the near extinction of the saltwater crocodiles, with there now only believed to be a few small pockets of them in the most isolated parts of the swamps. I personally find the Battle of Ramree Island to be one of the most interesting of World War II, and that says a lot because there's a lot of well-known interesting battles and a lot of unknown ones that are even stranger. But this one stands out for one very specific reason, and that's the fact it's remembered at all, because name one other battle that happened in the Burma campaign. Name just one at all. Hell, the Japanese at one point almost invaded India proper, but I have never heard that told in any documentary. It's always just focusing on things like Stalingrad, the defense of Britain, the fall of France, and of course, Normandy. But out of everything that happened in Burma, from it being invaded to being liberated, only one battle is widely remembered, and that is one that happened on the tiny little island of Ramree Island. And let's just point out the obvious fact here, the only reason this battle is ever retold is because of the man-eating crocodiles. And maybe sharks. I just think that, above all, is what makes it so interesting to me. In this entire country, millions and millions of people fighting, this is the most remembered one. All because of some hungry snappy boys. Of course, after doing a lot of research, and I hope you as well, have found that the entire thing is pretty interesting in itself. From how just dominating the Allies' advance was, to the desperate situation the Japanese would find themselves in, and the real versus fake story. Okay, I have no idea how well this video is going to be perceived. Like, I had to use a lot of maps, and my artistic skill isn't the best, so I had to, you saw. It was also super difficult to know exactly where positions were or how much area was captured. I had to improvise a lot of that just based off estimates, but I hope it was at least somewhat accurate. I did do a lot of research though to make sure every crucial fact I said was true to the best of my knowledge, so I'm confident it won't affect the overall narrative. I don't know, this is probably the most different video I've made so far, so let me know what you think. I'd actually be really interested if you wanted to see more stuff like this with, maps and all that fun stuff. And yeah, aside from that, I don't think I have anything else to add. I'm still very surprised that so many people claim the story of the man-eating crocodiles is 100% true, like
1,000 Japanese soldiers were eaten by crocodiles, by saltwater crocodiles.
What? No, I can confidently say it is not. So maybe this video will educate people a bit more. Maybe, I don't know. Just before we go, I want to quickly say thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please do subscribe to the channel. A new video coming out every 2 to 3 weeks, and yeah, hope you have a fantastic day. Lads and ladies, see you all later. Bye bye.